Today, there are an estimated 600,000 chemical products in use, with more being created each year. In fact, you could say we're surrounded by chemicals, at work and at home. These products are helpful and often vitally important to our lives. We know, however, that some chemicals, if not handled properly, can be dangerous to our health and our safety. To protect you from the effects of certain chemicals found in the workplace, the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, issued a rule called the Hazard Communication Standard, also known as the Right to Know Law. As a result, all employers are required to provide their employees with information on chemical hazards. The intent of the standard is simple: to help employers and employees become more aware of the chemicals in their workplace. This video and accompanying materials are designed to cover the basic requirements of the Hazard Communication Standard and to explain how it all applies to you.
The Hazard Communication Standard is a very broad standard as regulations go. In other words, HazCom covers any company that has as few as one employee who has as few as one chemical that he's exposed to. Because of the dangers of chemical exposure and accidents, it's important for employees to learn about how to properly handle and use chemicals.
To be classified as hazardous, a chemical must have either a physical or a health hazard associated with its use. Physical hazards deal with the chemical's physical properties. For instance, certain chemicals, if not handled properly, may explode or catch fire. Chemicals that present a health hazard produce reactions within the body. These chemicals can cause you to become ill right away or at a later date. These are called acute and chronic hazards. Acute hazards are short-term. For example, a dermatitis that results from a one-time exposure of your skin to a chemical. Chronic health hazards, on the other hand, are long-term, resulting from repeated exposures to elements such as asbestos or to chemicals that are known to cause cancer. The Hazard Communication Standard requires that you be informed of any chemical that possesses either physical or health hazards. This is done in a number of ways: through the hazardous chemical inventory, using and understanding material safety data sheets, proper labeling of chemicals, employee information and training, and a written hazard communication program. The standard first requires the chemical manufacturer or importer to evaluate each chemical for hazardous properties. The manufacturer then places the evaluation results on container labels and on a form called a Material Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS, which comes with the initial chemical shipment. Your employer should then review each MSDS and label and pass that information along to you in a training session. The standard also requires employers to develop a written program that outlines where material safety data sheets will be kept, how labels will be used, and how employees will receive hazard information and training. Most importantly, every aspect of the standard was designed with your safety in mind. Let's look at how the Hazard Communication Standard works. We'll start with the hazardous chemical inventory. An important step in learning about hazardous chemicals is knowing what chemicals are used or stored within the company. This includes chemicals taken off-site for use in other locations and those stored away from the main plant. Compiling a hazardous chemical inventory sounds like an easy job, but all too often the list is not complete. For instance, the inventory could be missing hazardous chemicals that someone thought were harmless. However, if a container label shows a hazard warning, the chemical must be on the inventory. Chemicals can also be overlooked, particularly items stored in seldom used cabinets. An inventory might also be incomplete, simply because it's sometimes difficult to keep it up to date. However it's done in your company, the hazardous chemical inventory is a key element in hazard communication and must be accurately maintained. Your employer is responsible for maintaining the inventory, but it's to your advantage to help keep it current. After all, you work near these chemicals and you should be aware of the risks involved. When you notice a new hazardous chemical in your work area, see if it's been added to the inventory. The chemical name on the inventory should be the same name as the chemical name on the container label and on the MSDS. If the chemical isn't listed, or if you can't find its MSDS, let your supervisor know. Also, be on the alert for overlooked chemicals. Areas such as hard-to-reach shelves often contain hazardous chemicals, some of which are no longer in use. Tell your supervisor if you find any questionable items. If the chemical is no longer needed, the company must dispose of it according to local environmental regulations. Depending on company size, your employer might compile one hazardous chemical list for an entire building, or prepare a separate inventory for each work area. Being aware of the chemicals and the hazardous chemical inventory for your area is an important step towards ensuring your safety. Now, let's take a look at what you'll find on a material safety data sheet. Chemical manufacturers and distributors must provide an MSDS that clearly identifies and describes the hazards involved on all chemicals they produce. Each MSDS may look a bit different, but they all must provide the same information. Basically, the MSDS must inform you how to safely use, handle, and store the chemical. The Hazard Communication Standard requires that material safety data sheets be easily accessible to employees. In any work area, always find out where the MSDS information is kept. Before using the chemical product, read the MSDS to find out what safety precautions are needed. Reading the MSDS beforehand can also save valuable time in the event of an accident. Remember, if you can't find an MSDS for a certain chemical, inform your supervisor at once. If this occurs, your employer must provide information and training on that chemical before you can continue to work with it. Here's what you'll find on an MSDS. The first section of the MSDS supplies the name of the chemical and the name and address of the manufacturer. The next section, usually called hazardous ingredients, lists what's in the chemical that can cause harm. The concentration of the chemical determines how much of a particular chemical you can be safely exposed to. This amount, commonly referred to as PEL, or permissible exposure limit, or TLV, threshold limit value, is given for a typical work shift. PEL and TLV limits are usually reported as parts per million, or ppm. As a general rule of thumb, the lower the number, the more hazardous the chemical. For example, a chemical listed as 1 ppm, or 1 part per million, is far more hazardous than one listed as 150 ppm. The MSDS then lists the chemical's physical characteristics, such as appearance and odor. The next section, fire and explosion data, tells you the temperature at which the chemical will ignite and provides information on how to safely extinguish a fire. The section entitled Health Hazards identifies symptoms that can occur if you are overexposed to the chemical. This could be listed as anything from a headache or burn to the comment, presents no health hazard. In some cases, your doctor may want information about the chemicals you're exposed to at work. You can obtain a copy of an MSDS for this purpose. In fact, some companies have MSDS request forms available. The reactivity section lists any material or environmental conditions that could produce a dangerous reaction with the chemical, such as water, other chemicals, heat, or direct sunlight. First aid and emergency procedures are also listed. Take time to become familiar with the information in this section for any chemicals in your area. In addition, the MSDS provides information on how to handle a leak or accidental spill of the chemical. The final section of the MSDS lists any other precautions you may need to follow when handling the chemical. This may include such things as the protective equipment required for cleanup of the spill and what safety signs to post near the chemical. On occasion, you'll see the words trade secret on the product identification, ingredients, or physical characteristics sections of an MSDS. This means that the manufacturer doesn't want to release certain product information that could fall into the hands of a competitor. In an emergency situation, however, this information must be provided to your employer or healthcare provider. Material safety data sheets contain a lot of information. At a minimum, look through the MSDS for each chemical in your work area and become familiar with the health hazards and the first aid precautions. Even if the hazardous chemical containers in your area are sealed, your employer must provide information and training on their hazards. In addition, you owe it to yourself to be aware of the risks involved. Now, let's take a look at how labels are used to communicate hazards. Hazardous chemical labels are another way of alerting you to potential dangers. The product labeling process starts with the chemical manufacturer, importer, or distributor who is responsible for labeling, tagging, or marking each container of hazardous materials that leaves their facility. If the chemical is shipped via tank truck or rail car, the label can be provided along with the shipping papers and the MSDS. While in transport, Department of Transportation placards serve as a hazard warning. The product label must list the hazardous chemical, the hazard warnings that apply, and the manufacturer's name. Any type of label is acceptable if it clearly conveys the information and is worded in English. Labels in other languages may be used in addition to the English version. When the chemical shipment reaches your facility, a company representative makes sure that each container is labeled before accepting the cargo. If a particular container isn't labeled, the employer is not responsible for relabeling. There are, however, several situations where the employer will relabel chemicals after the shipment is in the workplace. Perhaps the most common reason for relabeling is to use a uniform labeling system. While uniform labeling isn't mandatory, using a labeling system that all employees recognize and understand can make it easier to identify the potential hazards. When you use a uniform labeling system, OSHA recommends that you leave the incoming label on the original container. Whatever labeling system your employer uses, it must clearly identify the chemical name and the hazards in words or symbols. All words must appear in English, although labels in other languages may be added. Another reason for relabeling is to break down a large quantity of a chemical preparation into several smaller containers for distribution throughout the company. In this case, each of the smaller containers must be labeled. Labels may not last forever. If they become dirty, unreadable, or fall off, the employer is responsible for applying new ones. Labeling of hazardous chemicals is a requirement of the standard. There are only a few exceptions. First, solid metals, such as a steel beam or metal casting, are exempt from labeling. However, if the metal goes through a manufacturing process that results in the emission of a hazardous chemical, it must be labeled. Second, portable containers, used to transfer a small amount of chemical from a labeled container, are exempt if the amount is used immediately by one employee. In this situation, the words immediate use mean that the chemical in the portable container can only be used by the employee who transfers it from a labeled container, and it must be used on that work shift. The container cannot be transferred to another worker at a shift change unless it is labeled. Third, labels are not required on products regulated by other agencies. This includes certain pesticides, foods, food or color additives, drugs, cosmetics, medical or veterinary devices, alcoholic beverages, and consumer products. And finally, signs, batch tickets, or placards can be used in place of labels on individual stationary process containers as long as the information is easily accessible to workers. You should also know that the federal standard doesn't require labeling on pipes or piping systems, but some states do require it. For the most part, the chemical manufacturer handles labeling. There are, however, some situations where the employer is responsible. For instance, an area that's commonly overlooked in regard to labeling is spray bottles. Each spray bottle should be labeled with the chemical name and the hazards of the substance inside. Another area that frequently gets overlooked is welding, where workers are exposed to a variety of air emissions and fumes. And the most prevalent hazard in the workplace is carbon monoxide. If you have an area where vehicles are idling or where forklifts are used, carbon monoxide is being emitted. Workers must be warned with signs, posters, or other materials about the potential hazards in these areas. It's important to remember that labels are not intended to be the sole or most complete source of hazard information, but they do warn you that a hazard does exist. Now we'll discuss information on training. The Hazard Communication Standard requires any company, large or small, that uses even one hazardous chemical to provide information and training for employees. This must be done at the beginning of each new assignment or whenever a new hazardous chemical is first used. Your employer is required to inform you of the following: the requirements of the standard, the places where hazardous chemicals are present in your work area, and the location and availability of the written program, the chemical inventory, and the material safety data sheets. Training concerning the specific hazardous chemicals in your work area is another requirement. Since some of you use chemicals more often than others, or use more hazardous chemicals, this chemical-specific training will be done according to the needs of your company. Some companies provide training by hazard groups, such as flammables or corrosives, while others use work locations. Whatever method is used, chemical-specific training must include how to detect the presence or release of a hazardous chemical and the physical and health hazards involved. Some examples of physical hazards include the explosive or flammable properties of a chemical. Health hazards range from minor irritants, which could cause an itching sensation, to corrosives, which could actually burn the skin. You must also receive training on measures you can use to protect yourself against these hazards. This includes the use of safe work practices, emergency procedures, and the proper personal protective equipment to use.
Once the hazard's been identified, the employer has the responsibility to provide the proper equipment. It could be a solvents-type glove or a glove for high and low temperatures, goggles for eye protection, or full face shields to protect the entire face. It could mean using a half-face piece respirator or a full-face piece respirator if eye irritants are involved. Also body protection, but there's hundreds of different types of equipment that's available. You have to determine what's best for you.
During hazard communication training, you'll also review the written program developed by your employer, including the type of labeling system used and how to use an MSDS to obtain hazard information. Of course, it's equally important to use common sense as you work with hazardous chemicals. Here are some tips. Since certain metals can react with chemicals, always remove your jewelry to avoid skin reactions. Use face or eye protection if there's a possibility of a hazardous chemical splashing in your face. If you wear contact lenses, check with your supervisor about obtaining prescription safety goggles. Make sure all safety gear is clean and returned to its proper place after use. Wash your hands thoroughly after working with hazardous chemicals. Do not eat, drink, smoke, or use personal items where hazardous chemicals are present. It is possible for toxic fumes or particles to enter your body as you swallow or inhale. Dispose of any hazardous chemical in the proper container, being careful not to mix chemical wastes. And finally, know what to do in case of a hazardous chemical spill or leak. Check your company policy for details. For instance, be sure you know how to notify the emergency personnel or spill team. If a coworker is affected by the incident, follow the first aid instructions on the MSDS. Again, check your company policy for more details. In the event that medical attention is needed, send the MSDS along with the coworker to the healthcare facility. Information and training about the hazardous chemicals in your workplace provides the background you need to safely do your job. There's just one more step: the written program. Every employer covered by the Hazard Communication Standard is required to create and implement a written program showing how the company has met all of the requirements of the standard. This program must explain how your employer determines the chemicals in your workplace that are hazardous. The method used, whether it be chemical manufacturers' evaluations, OSHA's chemical lists, or independent testing, must be documented. The program must also describe the company's labeling system and how material safety data sheets are received and kept. Sample labels and MSDSs should be included as well. The names of those in charge of labeling, MSDS collection, and inventory must also be noted. This is important for you to know in case you have questions about this information. The written program must also spell out how hazardous chemical training is done. This includes methods used for chemical-specific training, the type of safety precautions taught, and what kind of emergency and first aid training is provided. Also required is the type of training provided for certain non-routine tasks, such as cleaning reactor vessels. How this information and training will be provided to contract employees must be covered as well. Once the written program is developed, it must be constantly revised and updated to remain current. Your input in this process is also very important. Let your employer know which parts of your training were the most helpful, and let your employer know if certain things were confusing or perhaps incomplete. The written program can then be revised with your suggestions in mind. By doing this, the training will really meet employees' needs.
The written program is a complete compilation of what the employer has done relative to hazard communication. It's the one source where you can go, you the employee can go to find out what's being done to protect you from hazardous chemicals.
Chemicals play an important part in our lives, both at home and at work. By using the framework provided in the Hazard Communication Standard, we can learn how to work safely with chemicals. Please take the time to review the chemical hazards in your area. In this way, we can all enjoy a safer work environment.